Hi there, and welcome to today's history lesson on the Roman army. Our learning challenge today is what was life like in the Roman army? So, the Roman army. The brilliance of the Roman army was key to Rome's success in building its empire. You don't conquer other people's lands if you have an army that is not very effective. And I know that you've done previous lessons where you've looked at how large the Roman Empire was. It was huge, covering the entire Mediterranean and even reaching as far north as parts of Scotland and as far south as Africa. It contained at the time about a quarter of the world's population. And the reason that Rome managed to do this was because it had an incredibly well trained army and well disciplined army. So, the start of the Roman army, well, in the beginning, the soldiers were the better off citizens, those people who lived in the Roman Empire who had money, who were sent home at the end of the war. The Romans copied the Greek armies and fought on foot with long spears. But as the Roman army grew, as the Roman Empire grew and its power grew, more and more people were made to join the army. The bigger your empire, the more enemies you get, the more soldiers you need. So how the army changed? As the army grew bigger, it had to fight further away from home. Now, being a soldier became a full-time job. So instead of just being called up when you were needed, your job was to be a soldier. You lived the life of a soldier. And therefore, the soldiers became highly trained and very tough. They were no longer sent home at the end of a battle. Now, the problem with having to fight further away from home means that your supply lines have got to be good. So wherever you're fighting, you need to have access to medical care, you need to have access to new equipment, you need to have access to food and clean water, etc. So the further away you go, the harder it becomes to fight. So the Roman army became a very, very, very intricate group where you would have your soldiers and you would have your supply lines all linked together in order to move things around the empire. So, for example, the Roman army built roads, and they built roads to be able to move troops from one place to another place very, very quickly. So, the start of the Roman army. Roman soldiers were grouped into large numbers called legions. There were about 30 legions or so at different times, but this did change during the several hundred years of the Roman Empire. Now, each legion was divided into 10 cohorts of 480 men. Cohorts were then divided into 6 centuries of about 80 men who were led by a centurion. I'll come back to that in just a minute. Centuries were divided into 10 groups of 8 men who shared a tent or a barrack crew. Now, going back to the centuries and centurion linked to 80 men. Now, the word cent is often means 100, okay? And the reason for this is that initially a centurion would lead 100 men, a century of men. But over time, that was cut down to 80. So they had cutbacks within the army. So they went from 100 men to 80 men, but they still called it a century, and it was still led by a key soldier who was called a centurion. So how did you become a legionary? The legions were made up of recommended Roman citizens. Recruits had to be 25, and they had to be in the army for at least 20 years. So you signed up for a long time. Legionaries were not allowed to be married whilst they were in the army. If you weren't a Roman citizen, that means that you happened to be someone who was living in a conquered land, you could still join the army, but as an auxiliary. Auxiliaries had special skills, such as horse riding or archery. Auxiliary soldiers would receive citizenship when they retired from the army. So that was kind of the way of getting them in there. If you join the army, if you survive, reach the end of it, we will grant you Roman citizenship and everything that comes with that. So some of their equipment. Now, if we have a look here, this is a typical Roman soldier's uniform. So they tend to wear a woolen tunic, and they wear that for several reasons. One, it has to go underneath the armour. It stops the armour rubbing against their skin, and it also keeps them warm. I mean, whilst Italy itself is quite warm and places like Greece and Africa are warm, you go to Northumberland in the middle of winter in northern England, and it's not warm in any way, shape, or form. So you will need a tunic underneath. You've got a balteus, which is the belt, it's got like the tassels on the front of it. Now, you might normally think, well, would they really want to hear the Romans come in? Absolutely. You imagine a huge army of Roman soldiers all marching in step. The noise that those things would create would be quite frightening for their enemies. They would carry a dagger, which was called a pugio. They would carry a short sword, which was called a gladius, and they would use that in hand-to-hand combat in close quarters. Their helmet was called a cassis. Caligae was their sandals, Roman sandals. So there were different types of that depending on which part of the empire you're in, because again, if you were in the north, then you would need something a bit warmer than just open sandals. Their plated armor was segmented, so it was called lorica segmentata. Their shield was a sort of rectangular shaped shield called a scrutum. Now, it was made out of wood, but it had a boss at the front, and they would use that to ram into their enemies as a part of an offensive weapon. It would also have a steel rim around, sorry, a metal rim, I should say, around the outside of it. And that was used for two purposes. One was to hold the wood together to stop it splintering when it was being hit by swords. The other thing it would do is you could use it to ram the shield up into your opponent's neck or smash it down onto their feet. So again, it could be used as a weapon if you'd lost your sword. And they often carried spears called pilums. Now, the pilum was quite interesting because they were designed to snap when they were thrown. And the reason for that is that the Romans believed that if you threw a spear and it went back to your enemy, you're effectively arming your enemy. So if it snaps, they couldn't use it back against you. So, Legionaries training. They'd learn to build camps, they'd learn to swim, sling stones, ride horses, mount and dismount horses fully armed. That is harder than it sounds. With his shield and no stirrups. So basically, could they get onto their horse quickly and fight quickly? They'd have to do drill once a day, twice if it was a new recruit. They'd have to march 30 kilometres 3 times a month wearing their armour, which weighed as much as 20 kilograms. That's an awful lot of weight. They'd learn how to use a sword, spear, and fight mock battles with weapons, which had covered tips for safety. You don't want your soldiers dying during training. Legionary training. The turtle was used to advance forwards towards enemies by creating a shell out of shields around a group of soldiers. Testudo was the Latin name for that. They'd use a wedge as well, which was to drive an enemy forward by creating a V shape. So they're, again, locking their shields together with their spears or swords out. The orb was a similar sort of thing, but they would be round in a circular sort of pattern. So this is if they had enemies on all sides of them. To repel cavalry, that's people on horseback, they would use this to protect against soldiers on horses. Soldiers would use their shields for protection, so they would have them at the side, locking their shields together, and they would also put the shields over the top to stop arrows dropping onto their heads and killing them. Punishments and rewards. The army was very disciplined. The soldiers were beaten if they didn't follow orders. Deserters, that's people who left their post or fell asleep on lookout, were beaten to death by their fellow soldiers. There is something else on this. It was called decimation. As a punishment, sometimes if somebody had fallen asleep on watch, their commanders would choose 1 out of every 10 men in that unit and kill them. So it really was, the onus was to do as you were told, when you were told, and to do your job properly. It was quite brutal. That is where the word decimate comes from. On a more positive note, there were awards for bravery and for different ranks, such as medals, arm, neckbands, gold crowns, silver spears, were often given to the officers, the people in charge. So surely the soldiers didn't spend all their time fighting. So what else did they do? Well, apart from fighting major battles, they built forts, they built bridges, they built roads. When they were on a campaign, they often built camps and fortified them with banks and ditches, often wooden palisades around the outside. In their spare time, they would often play board games with counters and dice, or visit the baths in order to keep clean. So this is Hadrian's Wall, running across the north of England, roughly between Carlisle and Newcastle in Cumbria and Northumberland, respectively. And it was a defensive wall that was built across there to separate the Roman Empire from the land of the Picts, okay? And it was built by the legions of Rome. That is something that we're going to cover in a lesson a little bit later on. So your first one is to label the different parts of the Roman centurion, okay? There is a sheet here with the gaps, there's a sheet here with the English words. As an extension, see whether or not you can add the Latin names to it as well. Your second sheet is design a Roman shield. And your third one is to imagine that you're a Roman soldier serving in Britannia, so that's Britain. Write a diary entry about a typical day in your life as part of the Roman army, as if you were stationed on Hadrian's Wall, looking out across the land of the dangerous Picts. Guys, good luck. See you later. Bye-bye.